The shape of the stone still stood like a doorway against the blue sky, but the entrance itself opened into a very dim corridor where a set of stone steps disappeared into the dark. And in a flash, Zan remembered that day. She was 13 years old and terribly impressed with her own witchy cleverness, and her teacher, once so strong and powerful, was fading by the day. "Be careful of your sorrow," he had said. He was so old then, impossibly old. He was all angles and bones and papery skin like a cricket. "Your sorrow is dangerous. Don't forget that she is still about." And so Zan had swallowed her sorrow and her memories too. She buried both so deep that she would never find them, or so she thought. But now she remembered the castle. She remembered its crumbly strangeness, its nonsensical corridors, and the people who lived in the castle, not just the wizards and scholars, but the cooks and scribes and assistants as well. She remembered how they scattered into the forest when the volcano erupted. She remembered how she put protective spells on each of them, well, each of them but one, and prayed to the stars that each spell would hold as they ran. She remembered how Zosmos hid the castle within each stone in the circle. Each stone was a door. Same castle, different doors. Don't forget. I mean it. "I won't forget," she said at 13. "You will surely forget, Zan. Have you not met yourself?" He was so old then. How did he get so old? He had practically withered to dust. But not to worry. I have built that into the spell. Now, if you don't mind, my dear, I have treasured knowing you, and lamented knowing you, and found myself laughing in spite of myself each day we were together. But that is all past now, and you and I must part. I have many thousands of people to protect from that blasted volcano, and I do hope you'll make sure they are ever so thankful. Won't you, dear?" He shook his head sadly. "What am I saying? Of course you won't." And he and the simply enormous dragon disappeared into the smoke and plunged themselves into the heart of the mountain, stopping the eruption, forcing the volcano into a restless sleep. And both were gone forever. Zan never did anything to protect his memory or to explain what he had done. Indeed, within a year she could barely remember him. It never occurred to her to find it strange. The part of her that would have found it strange was on the other side of the curtain, lost in the fog. She peered into the gloom of the hidden castle. Her old bones ached, and her mind raced. Why had her memories hidden themselves from her? And why had Zosmos hidden the castle? She didn't know, but she was certain where she would find the answer. She knocked her staff against the ground 3 times, until it produced enough light to illuminate the dark, and she walked into the stone. Chapter 11, in which a witch comes to a decision. Zan gathered books by the armload and carried them from the ruined castle to her workshop. Books and maps and papers and journals, diagrams, recipes, artwork. For 9 days she neither slept nor ate. Luna remained in her cocoon, pinned in place, pinned in time too. She didn't breathe, she didn't think, she was simply paused. Every time Glurk looked at her, he felt a sharp stab in his heart. He wondered if it would leave a mark. He needn't have worried. It surely did. "You cannot come in," Zan told him through the locked door. "I must focus." And then he heard her muttering inside. Night after night, Glurk peeked into the windows of the workshop, waiting as Zan had lit candles and scanned through hundreds of open books and documents, taking notes on a scroll that grew longer and longer by the hour, muttering all the while. She shook her head. She whispered spells into lead boxes, quickly slamming the door shut the moment the spell was uttered, and sitting on the lid to hold it in. Afterwards, she'd cautiously open the box and peek inside, inhaling deeply as she did so, through her nose. "Cinnamon," she'd say, "and salt. Too much wind in the spell," and she'd write that down. Or "methane, no good, she'll accidentally fly away. Plus, she'll be flammable, even more than usual." Or, "Is that sulfur? Great heavens, what are you trying to do, woman? Kill the poor child?" She crossed several things off her list. "Has Auntie Zan gone mad?" Firion asked. "No, my friend," Glurk told him, "but she has found herself in deeper water than she expected. She is not accustomed to not knowing exactly what to do, and it is frightening to her. As the poet says, 'The fool, when removed from solid ground, leaps from mountain top to burning star to black, black space. The scholar, when bereft of scroll, of quill, of heavy tome, falls and cannot be found.'" "Is that a real poem?" Firion asked. "Of course it's a real poem," Glurk said. "But who made it, Glurk?" Glurk closed his eyes. "The poet, the bog, the world, and me. They are all the same thing, you know." But he wouldn't explain what he meant. Finally, Zan threw the doors of the workshop wide open, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. You see, she explained to a very skeptical Glurk as she drew a large chalk circle on the ground, leaving a gap open to pass through. She drew 13 evenly spaced marks along the circumference of the circle and used them to map out the points of a 13-pointed star. In the end, all we are doing is setting a clock. Each day ticks by like the perfect whirring of a well-tuned gear, you see. Glurk shook his head. He did not see. Zan marked out the time along the almost complete circle, a neat and orderly progression. It's a 13-year cycle. That's all the spell will allow. In less than that, in our case. I'm afraid. The whole mechanism synchronizes to her own biology. Not much I can do about that. She's already 5, so the clock will set itself to 5 and will go off when she reaches 13. Glurk squinted. None of this made any sense to him. Of course, magic itself always felt like nonsense to the swamp monster. Magic was not mentioned in the song that built the world, but rather had arrived in the world much later, in the light from the stars and moon. Magic to him always felt like an interloper, an uninvited guest. Glurk much preferred poetry. I'll be using the same principle as the protective cocoon that she sleeps in. All that magic is kept inside. But in this case, it will be inside her, right in front of her brain, behind the center of her forehead. I can keep it contained and tiny, a grain of sand. All that power in a grain of sand. Can you imagine? Glurk said nothing. He gazed down at the child in his arms. She didn't move. It won't, he began. His voice was thick. He cleared his throat and started again. It won't ruin things, will it? I think I rather like her brain. I would like to see it unharmed. Oh, Piffle, Zan admonished. Her brain will be perfectly fine. At least I'm more than fairly sure it will be fine. Zan? Oh, I'm only kidding. Of course she will be fine. This will simply buy us some time to make sure she has the good sense to know what to do with her magic once it is unleashed. She needs to be educated. She needs to know the contents of those books there. She needs to understand the movements of the stars and the origins of the universe and the requirements of kindness. She needs to know mathematics and poetry. She must ask questions. She must seek to understand. She must understand the laws of cause and effect and unintended consequences. She must learn compassion and curiosity and awe. All of these things. We have to instruct her, Glurk, all 3 of us. It is a great responsibility. The air in the room became suddenly heavy. Zan grunted as she pushed the chalk through the last edges of the 13-pointed star. Even Glurk, who normally wouldn't be affected, found himself both sweaty and nauseous. And what about you? Glurk said. Will the siphoning of your magic stop? Zan shrugged. It will slow, I expect. She pressed her lips together, little bit by bit by bit. And then she will turn 13, and it will flow out all at once. No more magic. I will be an empty vessel with nothing left to keep these old bones moving. And then I'll be gone. Zan's voice was quiet and smooth like the surface of the swamp, and lovely as the swamp is lovely. Glurk felt an ache in his chest. Zan attempted to smile. Still, if I had my druthers, it's better to leave her orphaned after I can teach her a thing or two. Get her raised up properly. Prepare her, and I'd rather go all at once instead of wasting away like poor Zosimos. Death is always sudden, Glurk said. His eyes had begun to itch, even when it isn't. He wanted to clasp Zan in his 3rd and 4th arms, but he knew the witch wouldn't stand for it, so he held Luna a little bit closer instead, and Zan began to unwind the magical cocoon. The little girl smacked her lips together a few times and cuddled in close to his damp chest, warming him through. Her black hair shone like the night sky. She slept deeply. Glurk looked at the shape on the ground. There was still an open walkway for him to pass through with the girl. Once Luna was in place, and Glurk was safely outside the chalk rim, Zan would complete the circle and the spell would begin. He hesitated. You're sure, Zan? He said. Are you very, very sure? Yes, assuming I've done this right, the seed of magic will open on her 13th birthday. We won't know the exact day, of course, but we can make our guesses. That's when her magic will come, and that's when I will go. It's enough. I've already outlasted any reasonable allotment of life on this earth, and I'm ever so curious to know what comes next. Come, let's begin. And the air smelled of milk and sweat and baking bread, then sharp spice and skin knees and damp hair, then working muscles and soapy skin and clear mountain pools, and something else too, a dark, strange, earthly smell. And Luna cried out just once, and Glurk felt a crack in his heart as thin as a pencil line. He pressed his 4 hands to his chest, trying to keep it from breaking in half.